Hansel and Gretel. Once upon a time, near a deep and endless forest, there stood a small little cottage. In that cottage lived a poor woodcutter, his 2 children, and their stepmother. The boy's name was Hansel, and the girl's name was Gretel. Hansel was small, but he was a very brave boy. His eyes were bright, and even when something difficult happened, he did not give up easily. Gretel was a child with a very warm heart. If she saw a little bird with an injured wing, she worried for it. On cold days, she would gently hold her father's hand. But their home was very poor. The winter had been long, and the food in the house was growing less and less. The pieces of bread in the cupboard became smaller each day, and the soup pot was often nearly empty. One night, as Hansel and Gretel lay in bed, they heard the low, heavy voices of the grown-ups speaking in the next room.
"There is hardly any food left in the house," said their father sadly. "There is not even enough bread for the children." Then the stepmother answered in a cold voice, "If things go on like this, we will all starve. Tomorrow morning, we must take the children deep into the forest and leave them there. It is the only way for us to survive." The father was shocked. "No," he said, "that is too cruel. How could I leave my own children alone in the forest?" But the stepmother would not change her mind. "There is no other way. If you cannot decide, then all of us will die of hunger."
The father let out a long, sorrowful sigh. Hearing this, Gretel trembled under her blanket, and quiet tears slipped onto her pillow. "Brother, are we really going to be left behind?" Gretel whispered. Hansel took her hand and held it tightly. "Do not worry, Gretel," he said softly. "I will think of a way. We will find our way home." When everyone had fallen asleep, Hansel quietly got out of bed. He opened the door as softly as he could and slipped outside. In the moonlight, he picked up little white pebbles from the yard and filled his pocket with them. They sparkled like tiny stars in the dark. The next morning, the stepmother gave the children a small piece of bread each. "Here," she said, "take this with you." Her words sounded kind, but there was no warmth in her voice. Their father led Hansel and Gretel into the forest. The path grew deeper and darker, and the trees stretched taller and taller around them. The wind rustled through the branches with a lonely sound. As they walked, Hansel kept turning around. Each time he did, he dropped one of the little pebbles from his pocket onto the ground. One by one, they fell along the path behind them. The stepmother noticed and asked, "Hansel, why do you keep looking back?" Hansel answered calmly, "I was looking at our little white cat sitting on the roof. I think she is saying goodbye to me." The stepmother frowned, but she said no more. At last, they came to a very deep part of the forest. "There," said the stepmother, "gather some sticks and make a fire. We are going into the forest to work. Stay here quietly until we return." The father said nothing. He could only lower his head. Hansel and Gretel sat beside the little fire and listened as their parents' footsteps slowly faded away. Soon, the sound disappeared completely. Gretel looked at her brother with frightened eyes, but Hansel spoke calmly. "Let us wait until the moon rises. When night fell, the forest became even stranger and quieter. The cheerful songs of birds were gone, and now there was only the sound of the wind and the distant call of an owl. At last, the round moon rose between the trees. Then Hansel stood up. "Now, Gretel," he said, "let us go." The two children walked slowly through the darkness, and there, in the moonlight, the little white pebbles began to shine. They glittered along the path like tiny stars scattered on the earth. "Brother, look!" cried Gretel. "The stones are shining." "Yes," said Hansel. "They will lead us home." So they followed the shining stones for a long, long time. And just as the sky began to grow pale with morning light, they found their way back to the cottage. Their father ran to them and held them tightly in his arms. His eyes were full of relief and sorrow. But when the stepmother saw them return, she was not pleased. Her face grew hard, and she pressed her lips together without a word. A few days passed, but life in the cottage did not become easier. There was even less bread than before, and the soup pot was emptier still. Then, one night, the children once again heard the voices of the grown-ups. "This time, they must be taken even deeper into the forest," said the stepmother firmly. "So deep that they will never find their way back." Gretel trembled with fear, but Hansel quietly clenched his jaw. He wanted to go outside and gather more pebbles, but this time the door had been locked. The next morning, the stepmother gave them each an even smaller piece of bread. Hansel did not eat his. Instead, he hid it in his pocket. Once again, they walked into the forest, and this time, Hansel tore the bread into tiny crumbs and dropped them little by little along the path. But birds in the sky were watching. Little sparrows, crows, and doves flew down and pecked up every crumb until none were left behind. That evening, the children were once again left alone in the forest. When the moon rose, Hansel said, "We will follow the crumbs." But no matter how hard they looked, there was nothing to be found. The crumbs had all disappeared. The path looked the same in every direction. "Brother," Gretel said, her voice trembling, "I cannot find the way." For the first time, even Hansel's face became troubled. But he did not want to frighten his sister more. So he said in as steady a voice as he could, "Let us keep going a little farther. We will find the way somehow." They walked all night, and then all the next day. But the forest had become a place they no longer recognized. They were terribly hungry. When they found a few wild berries, they shared them. When they came to a stream, they cupped their hands and drank. Still, their hunger only grew. At last, as they wandered through the woods, they saw a beautiful white bird perched on a branch. It was singing in the sweetest voice. "Brother, should we follow it?" asked Gretel. Hansel nodded. "Yes, it feels as if it is leading us somewhere." The white bird flew from branch to branch, from tree to tree, and the children followed. At last, deep in the middle of the forest, it led them to the strangest and most wonderful little house they had ever seen. The roof looked as if it were made of crisp gingerbread. The walls looked like sweet cake and bread. The windows shimmered like clear sugar, and the doorway was decorated with colorful sweets. Gretel's eyes grew wide. "Brother, this looks like a house we can eat." Hansel stared at it in amazement. "Let us taste just a little," he said. Hansel broke off a tiny piece of the roof. "It tastes like gingerbread." Gretel nibbled the edge of the window. "It tastes like sugar." The two hungry children had just begun to eat when the door creaked open. An old woman stepped outside very slowly, leaning on a cane. "Oh, my dear children," she said, "who is nibbling at my little house?" Hansel and Gretel jumped in fright. But the old woman smiled in such a gentle, sweet way that they felt less afraid. "You poor little things," she said. "Were you so hungry? Do not stand outside in the cold. Come inside, and I will give you warm milk, bread, cake, and fruit." The children were so hungry and so tired that her words sounded wonderful. So after looking at each other, they carefully stepped inside. The house was even more marvelous on the inside. The table was covered with bread spread with jam, little jars of honey, soft cakes, and bowls of fruit. Hansel and Gretel ate until they were full for the first time in many days. Then they were given warm little beds, and soon they fell fast asleep. But the old woman was not kind at all. She was a wicked witch who lived in the forest. She had built her sweet house to lure children in so she could trap them and eat them. The next morning, Hansel awoke with a start. A bony hand seized him, and a rough voice cried out, "Now you are mine." Hansel was terrified. The witch was much stronger than she looked. In a moment, she locked him inside a little cage. "Brother!" Gretel cried. The witch glared at her. "Do not cry, useless girl," she snapped. "You will work in the kitchen. I shall feed your brother until he is plump and fat, and then I will eat him." Gretel was so frightened that her legs shook. But every day the witch forced her to work. She had to fetch water, light the fire, knead the dough, and clean the vegetables. Several times a day, the witch would go to Hansel's cage and shout, "Stick out your finger. Let me feel how fat you have grown." But Hansel was clever. He soon realized that the witch's eyes were very weak. So instead of his finger, he held out a thin little chicken bone. The witch would touch it and grumble, "How strange. Why are you still so thin?" Days passed. Then more days passed. Still, the witch believed Hansel had not grown fat enough. Whenever Gretel had the chance, she would go near the cage and whisper, "Brother, I will save you somehow." And Hansel would whisper back, "Gretel, do not give up." At last, one day, the witch lost her patience. "I will wait no longer," she shouted. "Thin or fat, today I will cook the boy." She dragged Gretel to the great oven. Inside, a fierce fire was burning. The heat filled the whole room. "Girl," said the witch, "look inside and see whether the oven is hot enough." At once, Gretel understood what the witch was planning. If she leaned into the oven,
the witch would push her inside. So Gretel pretended not to understand. "I do not know how to do it," she said. "I am too small." The witch stamped her foot angrily. "You foolish child! This is how it is done." And with that, she bent forward herself to look into the oven. At that very moment, Gretel found her courage. She was small and frightened, but her love for Hansel made her strong. With both hands, Gretel gave the witch a great push. The witch fell forward into the oven with a terrible cry, and Gretel quickly slammed the oven door shut. Suddenly, the room became silent. Gretel stood there, her heart pounding. Then, remembering Hansel, she ran as fast as she could to his cage. "Brother, brother, we are safe now." With trembling hands, she unlocked the cage. Hansel stepped out and threw his arms around her. "Gretel, you saved me," he said. "You were so brave." The two children held each other and cried for a long time. All the fear, loneliness, and sorrow they had carried seemed to pour out at once. After a while, Hansel said, "Now we must go home. But before we leave, let us see if there is anything here that can help Father." So they searched through the witch's house, and there, in corners and chests, they found treasures beyond belief. There were pearls, bright rubies, sparkling jewels, and shining gold coins. Gretel gasped. So much treasure. Hansel filled his pockets and said, "With this, Father will never have to go hungry again." The children filled their pockets and Gretel's apron with as many jewels and coins as they could carry, and then they hurried away from the witch's house. The forest was still deep and unfamiliar, but now their hearts were filled with hope. After walking for a long time, they came to a wide stretch of water. There was no bridge, and they did not know how to cross. Just then, a beautiful white duck came gliding over the water. Gretel spoke softly. "Dear white duck, will you help us? Will you carry us across the water?" As if it understood her, the duck came close. First, Hansel climbed on, and the duck carried him safely across. Then it returned for Gretel and carried her too. On the other side, the children began to recognize the forest. The scent of the trees, the shape of the path, the little roof in the distance. It was home. They ran as fast as they could and burst through the cottage door. "Father!" Their father turned, and the moment he saw them, tears filled his eyes. "Hansel, Gretel, my dear children, you are alive." He gathered them both into his arms and held them tightly. Ever since they had disappeared, he had not known a moment of peace. Soon, the children learned that the stepmother was no longer there. Now only the father, Hansel, and Gretel remained in the cottage. Then Gretel opened her apron and poured out the jewels. Hansel emptied his pockets, and shining gold coins spilled across the table. The little cottage filled with light and sparkle. Their father stared in amazement. "What is all this?" Hansel smiled. "Now we will never be hungry again, Father.
That evening, the three of them ate a warm and filling meal together. And as they sat by the fire, they felt something they had not felt in a very long time. They felt safe. Hansel had grown braver than before. Gretel had grown stronger and more courageous than anyone could have imagined. And their father, looking at his children, made a quiet promise in his heart. No matter how hard life became, he would never let them go again.
And so, though there were still difficult days from time to time, they remembered what they had learned in the dark forest. If you hold on to each other, if you do not give up, and if you keep walking even through the darkest night, you may yet find your way home. And from that day on, they lived together in warmth and happiness for many long years. The end.